What is going on, everyone? It is time for my film reveal video. This is where I take a look at my film for the very third time. Typically I like to record these videos as soon as I get back from a trip, but this time, I don't know, it was a little different. I think the stakes were higher since it was a backpacking trip and I didn't shoot as many photos, so I wanted to see them right away. And so I've actually already scanned the film in and have some thoughts on it. And it might be a bit of an interesting perspective looking at the film now after I've scanned it, because I'll be able to tell you what I did with those scans. So I have the film in protective sleeves here, and I have a camera above, got this camera here, and let's go ahead and take a look at it. So this is the very first photo I shot on the trip, and I really liked the way that we had this shell of sandstone here with a different layer underneath, and this was on a wall. But I really liked this shape. I like how it was mirrored with those, but I liked how this negative space was balanced with this positive space. So I tried to make sure I gave it enough space right here, because for me that distance right there was very important, as was this distance and this distance, and just trying to find a way to balance everything visually. This one ended up being a little tricky to edit because there is a inherent warm cast to this image, because this was taken in some decently strong reflected light. And when I scanned it in, I wanted to pull out some of the natural blue tones that were in here. So I had to minimize the color cast while still giving it the warmth. So what I did is I went into the channels, took the red channel and dropped it down a little bit from the middle to remove some reds. And when you take away red, it allows you to have a little bit more cyan in the image, which is the opposite color, which makes this balance a little bit better. So I'm still in the process of tweaking that image to get a feel for it. But I did know right away that this one would need to have a little bit of the color cast removed, but the exposure is perfect. Look at my darkest tones in here, brightest tones in here. So everything worked out really well for that. Pretty easy to meter. And it was certainly good to get that first photo out of the way on the trip. Now this one is a bit of a tricky image, because it's a visually busy image, but that happens with this part of the canyon where you have lots of lines going in every direction. And I think I was hoping that there'd be a bit more color separation between the greens and the juniper and the warmer tone of the sandstone. But there is a little bit of a magenta cast to this image, and I'm still tweaking this one. I don't think I'm ever going to be able to get this one to be the way I want it to be. I think it's just, there's too much visual noise, too much busyness in this image, but it's just the nature of the subject. This is the Cayenta sandstone formation, which, as I understand it, was kind of riverbeds. So you have all these different layers, as opposed to some of the areas which was sand dunes, so it's more continuous. But I'm still working on this one, but I did try to minimize the magenta cast in it and try to work in some more of the greens and the cooler tones in there. In terms of composition, I was mostly trying to center it, giving a little space here on the outside of that boulder. And you can see there's one little bit of a bush creeping into view there, so I had some plants down below I was trying to avoid, but we'll see. Maybe eventually I'll be able to edit this one to my liking, but it is definitely a bit on the busy side. Now I knew that this would not be the ideal light for this situation, but earlier, I guess on the previous day, I walked past this scene when these grasses were backlit by the sun, and this wall was in shade, and it was really beautiful. All the vivid colors from here set against the subtle textures of the wall in the background. But also, that's going to happen more toward the late afternoon. And what also happens in the late afternoon? Wind. And so I figured I would at least take a photo of it in the morning in the subdued light, because who knows, maybe it'd be okay. But I also kind of knew it would be on the flat side. But this is definitely a scene I want to try to photograph on a future visit to the canyon in the afternoon. It just has to be a relatively calm day so I don't get movement on these. You see there is a tree branch that creeps into view there, which I did not see when I was composing it. The corners of a large format camera, especially an 8x10, are hard to see. The lenses are very dim, so it's very easy for something like that to creep into view. Also, I was in a little bit of a hurry trying to get to the other subject while the conditions were still good. So this is more of a sketch of this particular subject for when I return next year, and see if I can photograph this when it's backlit, because I think that will make for a pretty cool photo. This is the tree that I was on my way to go photograph when I stopped and photographed the grass. And I first noticed this tree last year, and I set up this exact composition on that trip. But then there were some clouds going over that spoiled the light. When setting up this composition, I liked the way that this tree was leaning into the composition, but we also have this line right here from this background sandstone. So they're leaning towards each other. You have a little bit of water there in the wash trailing off in the distance. I like the root. I wanted to make sure I showed the end of the root. Sometimes you can chop that stuff off and you're okay, but given the ability to show where that root enters the ground, I think was good. I was paying attention to that amount of space up there. But overall, I'm quite happy with this. I wanted to make sure that the leaves either did not cross this boundary, or they crossed the boundary with purpose. And because I know that this right here would become a source of visual tension if those leaves are getting pretty close to that edge. So I want to have a little bit of a buffer there where they're visually connected, but they are not a source of distraction. Overall, I'm quite happy with this. Exposure is pretty decent. It could have been a little bit brighter, but what I was balancing was the brightness of the mineral deposits here down in the wash. So if I went any brighter with this would get blown out, and I have detail in the shadows. This one was a little bit tricky to edit on the computer because there's a bit of a reddish tone to it, and I wanted to minimize that. So I took some reds out, and I also took some blues out as well, just by taking the middle of the curve for red and blue to introduce some yellows and also a little bit of cyan, which seemed to give it a more natural color balance. But it was absolutely calm that morning. Not a single leaf is moving, which is kind of fun. So that's nice to have those sort of conditions, but I'm quite happy with how that one turned out. This is a bit of a tricky scene because there's not a lot of color separation in this. And I think it's because the light just wasn't great. There were a couple clouds up there. And when you have some clouds, it really takes away that sense of reflected light. And so it ends up being a little bit dull, and the greens aren't really popping that much. The warm tones of the rock, there's a bit of a reddish magenta-ish color cast going on. So I actually had to scan this twice. The first time I scanned it, I just couldn't separate the tones of the green from the cactus from everything else. And I was a little more careful when I scanned it a second time, because I wanted to make sure that the cool tones that should be present more so in some of the lichens and such, that comes through a little bit more. And so I had to do some tweaking of the tone curve in order to bring out the greens and separate those. So if you have a color cast, like here, a bit of a warm color cast, sometimes you actually have to add cool tones in order to separate those colors, and you can tweak the saturation a little bit to bring the warm tones back in. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but in terms of composition, I'm good with it. I do wish the light was better, and I was able to make it work as well as I could on by adjusting the curves. But I still would have loved to have seen this with true reflected light, because that way you'd have cool tones getting down in some of the shadow areas. So kind of blue tones in there, and you get this warm, cool color combo, which makes it more dimensional and a lot less flat. But cool subject. Always pretty fun how those cacti tend to grow in very crazy places. This is a bush that I've had my eye on for a while now, but we do have that Cayenta sandstone in the background, which is very visually distracting. I was hoping that the light on the foreground would be strong enough that this would be a little bit brighter and this would drop off a little bit. But I was really toward the end of my window of light, and as a result, it was fading pretty quickly. And so I didn't have as strong of light on this as I would have liked. I scanned it, I tried to darken down this a little bit, brighten this a little bit to help separate it, and it works okay. But it ultimately is very busy. I love seeing these roots down here. I love seeing this earth here, these roots. I mean, I love all those elements. I just wish that the background was simpler, and so that this would stand out more against the background. I'll have to sit on it for a while, but it's not quite what I had in mind, and I had about the best conditions that I could ask for a situation like that. So it could be it's the best I could do for that. All right, we're powering through these. Now this is my final subject that I returned to photograph, and light very good here. The conditions were very good. There was no wind. So this area is elevated above the wash, and when I was hiking through here a day or so before, I noticed that this area became a wonderful glow chamber in the kind of mid-morning. And so then I started looking at all the various plants that were growing, because this ledge continues for quite a ways. But I was looking at all the plants that were growing there and trying to see if I can isolate some of them up against an interesting background, which is when I saw this cluster of bushes here, 3 bushes, which is important. Odd numbers usually look good. But I saw it against this interesting alcove here. And so I knew basically where to stand, when the light would be good. And I framed a composition with this. I think I used either my 300 or my 240. I put it in my notes. I think my 300. But I like the way that you have these lines coming in here. You have some cool tone in that bit of desert varnish up there. A bit of a swooping edge here. Some randomness in the foreground, which makes it a bit more real and less sterile in a way, with some fallen branches there. I really like the way this one turned out. So very sharp, I focused right on there. For the most part centered it, but I used my framing tool just to, when I look through there, I try to figure out which side is more important. Is it the right side or is it the left side? And I scoot either way with the framing tool, holding it to my eye, to figure out how much I need to include of either of those sides. And then I'll know which landmarks to look for when I look through the ground glass and compose it. But very, very happy with how this one turned out. So this is one of my favorites for the trip. I'm very glad I went back for it. My other favorites would be the Cottonwood that is kind of at an angle there against that big wall of sandstone. And then the first photo I shot, the abstract of the flaky rock, kind of similar to the areas you see back in there. But 3 photos I'm happy with out of taking 7 is pretty good. So the spring backpacking trips are oftentimes the more difficult ones, just because I don't have the luxury of being able to take a lot of pictures. And so you gotta make sure that every photo counts and wait for those really ideal conditions. But I wanna thank Evan for watching, and we'll see you around next time. You may have noticed this video has no ads and no sponsors, and I think it's nicer that way. If you enjoy this ad-free and clickbait-free content and want to help me live my dream, a voluntary contribution through PayPal or by joining my Patreon. Helps keep my gas tank full and my film freezer stocked. You can find more information by visiting my website at benhorne.com/donate. I also have prints, ebooks, and my annual portfolios available on my website. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you around next time.